right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pat Collier, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs here at the Center for American Progress. I have the pleasure of welcoming you all here today for an important conversation with our distinguished guest, Congressman Cedric L. Richmond, Chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. For over 40 years, the CBC has held the distinction of being considered the conscience of Congress. Their efforts to ensure all Americans can participate in this democracy, their efforts to eliminate health disparities and expand economic opportunities for communities of color, to create a more equitable approach to policing and criminal justice, and to increase educational investments in public schools and in historically black colleges and universities, have provided a moral compass to the important work our Congress tackles every day. That insight, that judgment, and that voice is needed now more than ever before. The chairman of this august body, Congressman Cedric Richmond, represents Louisiana's 2nd Congressional District and currently serves on the House Committee on Homeland Security and Judiciary. Born and raised in New Orleans, Congressman Richmond is a strong believer in the value of mentorship. His undergraduate degree is from Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, one of this country's most distinguished HBCUs, and his Juris Doctorate is from Tulane University in New Orleans. Mr. Richmond is also a graduate of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And in November of last year, Congressman Richmond was elected the 25th chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. And today he shares his vision with us all. Moderating today's discussion is Center for American Progress Action Fund President Neera Tanden. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Neera Tanden and Chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Cedric Richmond.
I just want to share and the congratulations to you for becoming chair of the CBC. It's kind of a fascinating time. First and foremost, I would love to just ask you about your agenda and the agenda of the Congressional Black Caucus in this new era that we're in.
Well, certainly it's a different era, and let me just wish everybody happy Mardi Gras today.
Thanks for being here.
I wish I was home enjoying the parades, but nevertheless, I'll get to see a carnival tonight anyway. Let me just say that the Congressional Black Caucus has traditionally been called the conscience of the Congress, which is, it's important to us. But it's not about having a conscience. It's really about having the strength and the will, the faith and the courage to follow your conscience and advocate for those things. But as we continue to keep our reputation as the conscience of the Congress, I don't want people to underestimate the intellectual capacity of the Congressional Black Caucus also. And so that's why I always make that distinction. But we're in a different time, and we didn't see this one coming, at least most of us did not. But, we're here and we'll deal with it. So some of the priorities for the caucus and our focus for the next 2 years is really the family unit and all of the things that encompass that, whether it's criminal justice reform or it's equal pay or education. One thing I think that the Democratic Party did not do a great job of doing is communicating to people how it all comes together and it connects. So for example, you would hear candidates and people talk about equal pay, but they never made the connection that because African American women make 60 cents on the dollar for every dollar that a man makes, and the fact that so many African American males are incarcerated, that those women that make 60 cents on the dollar are actually the breadwinner and the head of the family. So why do I say that? Well, keep going with the connection. So then we start looking at public education, and we start blaming the teachers for the fact that our public education students aren't doing as well as their private school counterparts. But nobody's talking about the fact that if the mother's working 2 jobs to bring home money, then of course there's not a someone in the house to help with homework or the tutoring or to do those things. Then if you look at the fact that broadband is a very, is not as readily accessible in poorer areas or rural areas, then you don't have the ability to go on and use technology to do that. So it's just a system that is really stacked against the family unit, especially if you're urban, especially if you're poor, or rural and poor, it doesn't really matter. So that's our focus, is trying to show people how it all comes together. And many of our policies are just nonsensical to me, but we've been far too polite. And while I'm on the party, let me just say that we did a poll with Cornell Belcher to just gauge African Americans after the election. 68% felt that the Democratic Party took African American voters for granted. And I'll tell you, I think that number is low because we had people in there that are not as engaged. But if you look at people that are engaged, you have a very large, overwhelming majority of African Americans who are not impressed by the party's outreach or positions. And that was very enlightening for us. So part of what we're going to do over the next 2 years is go on a listening tour to communities across the country, go on a HBCU tour. We've been to Morehouse and we've been to Xavier University so far. So we're going to go where people are as opposed to asking people to come up here.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I definitely want to probe into the economic concerns, because I think that is a uniting concern for a lot of communities. And the focus on how people are actually feeling is profound. But I think also in this moment where we're going to hear a State of the Union tonight, I think a lot of people are anxious about the kind of rhetoric that has developed in the country. And I mean, we were seeing graver incidents of hate crimes in America, affecting all communities. African American communities have been particularly hard hit with the rise of white nationalism. I mean, it's 2017, and we're talking about the rise of white nationalism. And I appreciate that the conscience of the Congress, as you make clear, encompasses more than just a moral authority. But I would love to just get your sense of what you think is happening in the country, why we're seeing these incidents, what national leaders of every political stripe should be saying. We have vicious hate crimes happening against African American school children, in which people are, using the Confederate flag as a kind of weapon. There was a story just the other day about a African American child's birthday party, group of white supremacists circling that. I mean, so I just think that a lot of people are wondering what is really happening in the country, and if you have thoughts on what national leaders should do and what each of us should do in this moment.
Well, I think we have to have the conversation. We can't be afraid to talk about race or to call people out, and not just when it's comfortable or convenient. So I read Alan Dershowitz's comments about Keith Ellison and how he would leave the Democratic Party if Keith Ellison was elected DNC chair. And my biggest question was, is that really your biggest concern right now with Jewish community centers all across the country being,
I hear you,
with death threats and the anti-Semitism going on, Steve Bannon in the White House, who's a bigot and everything else you want to call him. And I think it's time for people of goodwill who normally are very comfortable in their own skin and in their own family to start talking about these things. And just because you talk about race does not mean you're harping on the past, but you can't get past it if you don't talk about it. And that's one of the things we found when we went to Xavier. One of the students asked us, I feel bad and people look at me when I start talking about specific cures for African American males and remedies that can help them on their journey. And he was asking what could he do about it, and I said the best thing you can do about it is keep talking about it. And I just think that, you know, it's different, but good people don't think through the whole thing. And I'll just give you an example. Paul Ryan, with this picture in the Capitol that raised all this concern, and a few people kept taking the picture down, and they would return it to the office. So the question was, Cedric, why are you so mad about the fact that, because I think I used the language, we'll kick somebody's butt or something if they take it down again. But the question was, why are you so angry about this? And the answer was it wasn't about just the painting.
Yeah.
It was a 17-year-old expressing his art. But part of the frustration was that it was about white men thinking that they could just take this painting down because they wanted to. It's not yours. Stop taking stuff that's not yours. And then I walked them through the history, whether you go all the way back to Native Americans or slavery or the rape and stuff that happened in slavery. That's my frustration. And let me just say, I think Paul Ryan is a well-meaning guy, but he never made all those connections. And when you make the connections, like, oh, wow, I didn't think of it that way. But we just have to talk about it, and I don't think we'll ever get past it. You can't heal if you don't have a proper diagnosis and then figure out how to move on. But you have a country that's divided. You know, it's almost like after Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And then you saw the Klan rise and this force to put us back in our place. And it seems as though that you're getting a little bit of that. And then you have a very immature president, to say the least. And I think that 45 feeds into this stuff and actually is not forceful enough to say, hey, let's move on. You know, and part of the reason I think is that he doesn't realize he's the president yet. When he realizes he's the president, I think that he'll have that moment where, hey, maybe I ought to bring this country together. But right now, it's as far apart as I've ever seen it. So.
Yeah, I wanted to I'll ask quickly about that, and then I'd love to return back to the economic issues you've raised and what we're seeing out of the Congress from Paul Ryan and others. But just to ask that question about why do you two things? Why do you think we're seeing this happen now? You mentioned Reconstruction; it's like a response almost. But also, why you're saying that basically Trump doesn't recognize he's president, but I think a lot of people are anxious that he's not saying anything, and that silence is sending its own message. I mean, there's obviously the situation in Kansas City in which, you know, a white supremacist thought he was killing Muslims, and he killed one Indian person and shot two others, one white, one Indian. There's the instances we're seeing around the country, and it's just like whenever we've had instances like this in the past, presidents speak to them. And I think there's a concern that there's a message being sent. But I would love your views on that, because I think you're seeing on social media and elsewhere, there's just like a deep anxiety that this is the beginning, these incidents like the Jewish cemeteries and images of children being evacuated because of bomb threats, what's happened to Latinos, African Americans, the silence seems to be particularly deafening.
It is. The silence speaks volumes. And to bullies, it's empowering them to do what they want. I mean, in order to stop a bully, somebody has to stand up to him. And with the president being silent, he still has yet to utter or address the Manual 9 in terms of his, the only thing he wants to talk about is, undocumented people committing crimes and things of that nature. But the biggest, and tonight he's bringing the family of a law enforcement officer that was killed by an undocumented person to the State of the Union. But if he would ever listen to police, look at statistics, or take a time to read anything, he would know that Sovereign Citizen has killed more police officers than any other group in the United States, and that's Americans, predominantly white, a few African Americans now, but just in my district alone, I think they've killed 5 police officers and injured maybe 6 more with shootings, but he won't utter those words. And that's the big concern, is that, it's almost like giving consent by omission. But and I just don't know if he thinks it's his role. I don't know if he thinks it's his base, and it very well could be his base. And whatever it is, it's just unfortunate that he occupies that space and does not see the need to check what's going on in the country, as if he doesn't see it, or maybe he just doesn't see it as a concern of his. Either or, I think that that's a problem. But that's where good people, I think, just have to step up and start talking, Republican, Democrat, black and white, and just force either the conversation or force change. I mean, you know, look, I'm in the South, and there's always been racial tensions there, but I am afraid of what happens next. This is not Reconstruction. I think that the Second Amendment, everybody enjoys that freedom, and what I don't want is everybody to exercise that freedom in defense of their liberties. And if you just let a group go unchecked all this time and thinking they can bully people, at some point, people fight back. And that's not what we want or need in this country. So I would just hope that at some point, he understands that the election is over and you have to govern accordingly. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the Republican Party stop feeding into the same foolishness. And you know, if you hear the new National Security Advisor, he talks about radical Islam is just not a smart word to use. It's not accurate, and it only flames the fire. It would be nice if the, you know, Steve Kings of the world and others would listen to that language. And for us, it's just time to call people out. You are who you are. If you keep doing the same thing, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And if you keep saying racist stuff over and over again, at some point we just have to say, dude, you're racist, and, you know, keep going.
Thank you. You mentioned Paul Ryan earlier, and your focus on ensuring that families are doing well, are succeeding, and you know, we're entering a budget process here where it really feels like families are going to take it on the chin. I'd love to just get your thoughts for large about the CBC's focus and how that applies to the range of issues that this Congress is looking at.
Well, again, if you're really trying to talk about upward mobility in the country, then there's some places you can go that's low-hanging fruit. You can start with HBCUs, and you can start with doubling Pell Grants. You can start with making Pell Grants year-round. Some people don't have the luxury to just wait as they matriculate. Some people need to go year-round so they can hurry up and get out and start to change their families. You can look at Head Start, for example, where you get a 9-to-1 return on every dollar we spend in Head Start. So why wouldn't we expand Head Start and make it more accessible and more robust, because we know that those kids are going to succeed later in life? Why don't we look at after-school programs? Why don't we look back to the faith community, not just when it's time to justify, you know, discrimination based on all these other things, but why don't you look at the faith-based community, especially in the African-American community, where they have after-school programs and other things that help kids achieve. And, you know, take a hard look at criminal justice reform, because we've passed the point of diminishing returns. Every dollar we spend on incarceration now, we make the country less safe. And that's just dumb. And those are the types of things that I think that a true budget should reflect. Also, you look at poverty and those issues, those types of things can be addressed. But you can't keep doing the same thing, which is we're going to have tax cuts, but somebody has to pay for them. So who's going to pay for them? Poor people are going to pay for rich people's tax cuts. Now, if that just isn't the definition of foolishness, then I don't know what is. But we keep doing it. And that's the thing that the CBC will be more vocal about and fight about, is that it just does not make sense. The difficulty we have is making sure that rural and poor whites understand that they're in actually the same boat, or food stamp line, or affordable housing line, or welfare line as poor and urban blacks and Hispanics and others. That poor people, rural or urban, black or white or whatever, they're all in the same boat. And if we can get them to understand that, then I think we can start moving the needle. So now you see the activism at town halls and others where, you know, finally, people of all races and other, it's like, oh, healthcare for me is really not a bad idea. This saved my child's life. I don't really care if you call it Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. I want it.
Yeah.
And that is refreshing to see the demographic you didn't think would be fighting for the Affordable Care Act, fighting for it. That's what gives us some courage, some hope that we're actually starting to see a movement that is just fighting for people. So we're excited about that, and we're gonna join it as best we can, and we're gonna help promote it, because I think that has the ability to really change this country.
Fantastic. I know your time is limited, and we'll get to the panel. I can't leave this without asking you about President, I still sometimes have trouble saying it, President Trump's event yesterday with HBCU members. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and then obviously the statement by Secretary of Education DeVos about HBCUs being the champions of choice without the recognition of how HBCUs actually got started has caused some controversy. And it's like every day you have to use understatement for what's happening. So I'd love your thoughts, and then we'll have time for a question or two from the audience.
You would put me in that situation. All right, so we'll start with the meeting with HBCUs in 45. If I had any,
do 45. That's what I'm going to do.
If I had any, well, I learned that as I went to New York to speak, and then I went to Columbus, Georgia to speak, and all of these people's consistent theme was 45, and they said, well, we'll start calling him president when he starts acting like a president, but until then he's 45. So I'm assuming the same posture. So part of what the problem is he's just petty. So because those presidents had never been in the Oval Office under President Obama, let me see if I can pack you all in the Oval Office so that we can take a picture. But at the same time, you announced that you're going to plus up defense spending by $54 billion and cut all these other places.
Yeah.
All of those other places are going to affect HBCUs and their survival. And whether it's education, whether it's all these other areas. So we will see in your budget if you want to help HBCUs, not just a photo op. Now, Tim Scott and Mark Walker convened all the HBCU presidents for listening sessions and others, and I think they're very genuine about recognizing the importance that HBCUs play, and they want their colleagues to understand the role they play and the bigger role they can play in terms of upward mobility, public safety,
right,
all of those things, entrepreneurship. So I think they're genuine. Do I think that the president is genuine in that? I don't. And we will see. I think it was just another example of being petty and not realizing that the campaign is over, and that just is what it is. Now, as far as the Secretary of Education, I just don't know where to begin or end. I think that it should scare people that that's the analogy that she made. I just went to Morehouse to speak at our 150th anniversary Founders Day convocation, and I can just tell you 150 years ago, Morehouse was not founded because of choice. Mm-hmm. And it was founded, 2 years after the Civil War ended, to educate former slaves to be ministers and teachers and leaders in the community. And it wasn't because of choice, it was because that was the only option. And I think it ignores history. I think it's an ignorant statement. And I think for someone who's over the Department of Education, it should terrify America. And the problem is now with their disdain for the media and their infatuation with alternative facts and fake news, she may say that enough to where some people may actually believe it.
Right.
And that's the scary
part.
But for someone to just, and look, Twitter, Black Twitter, and everybody's just eating her alive, rightfully so. Because what did you miss about white only and colored only? I mean, you know, and I just can't wait to, you know, their description of you know, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and all those people. But, you know, they just miss
Right.
a whole bunch of things. I'm just glad now they understand that Frederick Douglass is not alive and well. So, you know, it's a struggle.
I hear you. Okay, we'll take a few questions. We'll just go quickly in the aisle. I know we're. And if you could just give your name and a quick question, that would be great.
Sure. My name's Bennett Minton. I'm a recovering lobbyist. My question is, what is the CBC's role in agitating for opposition to Jeff Sessions' agenda at the Civil Rights Division?
We're going to have to be his constant and the country's constant reminder of how important the Civil Rights Division is and how contrary that his stances are to civil rights, whether it's their decision to abandon the voter ID case in Texas, which, by the way, we were winning. You know, that's just a start question. But I think we have to call them out. And every chance we get, we will, and we have the ability to hold our own informal type hearings. You'll see some of that tomorrow. And we will do all that we can to show in a transparent fashion that he is who we thought he was. And how do you get to your confirmation hearing? You rewrite your civil rights history. You do a commercial with you and John Lewis, and you talk about actually fighting for voting rights. And then the first thing you do, you abandon a case of voter disenfranchisement. And he's exactly who we thought he was. And that's the part that we just have to continue to remind the country. And look, it may be a long 2 years, but I think if we put in the work now and we do what we're supposed to do, especially as a CBC, in 2 years we can hopefully kind of right the ship with taking over the Senate or the House and then having the ability to call real hearings and do oversight just like the Republicans did after the first 2 years of President Obama. And that's why we're going to every community to let them understand that elections have consequences. And this election is going to have a big consequence for 2 years, and we need to right the ship and right it now. But part of what you can't do is let Jeff Sessions get over there in that building and do those things in the dark of night and not bring attention to it. So that will be part of our role as well as fighting him on every step.
I'm a recovering lawyer and lobbyist, but I was chief counsel for Senator Kennedy and Congressman Conyers. Everybody, CAP and CBC and everyone has a long shopping list of things that can be done, all of which or most of which require money. It seems to me the biggest challenge you have at the CBC is the dramatic shift that the president wants to make to increase defense spending by cutting domestic. How can the CBC most effectively energize all the Democrats, maybe by working through the Progressive Caucus more than just as the CBC or the Latino Caucus, to show the kind of pressure that they demonstrated at the fight for the Democratic National Committee chair, to get the Democrats to hang tough like they did in the fights over the cabinet nominations in the Senate?
Well, part of it is to have a position and believe in it. And look, I still have some hard feelings out there. I don't believe that a real Democrat could vote for Sessions. And if you voted for Sessions, don't expect us to go to your pulpit or vouch for you. I don't care if you have 1% African American in your state or 2 or 3 or 4. You're probably going to need it in this election, and I won't be there for you. Because if you can't stand with me in my most important fight, I don't really need you. You might as well be a Republican. And you know who I'm talking about, and I don't hold any punches about it. But the other thing is getting our party back in line also. So when I say that 68% of African Americans think the party takes them for granted, the party does. If you look at where the party spends its money, it spent right around 90% of its resources going after the 36% white vote that it received. It spent 10% of its resources going after black and brown vote, which it received 90% of that vote. And I'm not saying that you need to reverse those numbers, but you can't have real outreach and engagement. And now I'm not talking about just black. I'm talking about everybody. You need to do outreach and engagement now, not wait till election time. So the resources that we spend, and a lot of it you're just wasting. Money on TV is a waste of money for the most part. But we should be out there organizing and giving tools to groups and action plans about how to engage the community, because that engagement actually changes policy as well as, gives you a leg up on the next election cycle. But the only way you do it is by demanding it. And we have had a conversation with everybody that was running for, all the big candidates that were running for chair of the DNC, to give them what our expectations were and our demands were in terms of outreach. And we also did, in conjunction with the Asian caucus and the Hispanic caucus, and we have done things with the Progressive caucus to let them know where we are and what our goals are. But we're going to have to drag the Democratic Party out of their comfort zone of what they've been doing, and that is losing. We just have to change that mindset, and that's not just the DNC, it's the DSCC, the DCCC, the Governors Association, and the legislative one. So we have to revamp what we do and how we do it, and we don't mind being the force that's bringing them along, because the people we represent hurt the most when we lose, and we can't afford to lose because you keep bringing these same group of people that live in a bubble and can't talk to average Americans to make them understand that how important an election is. And I'll just say this publicly, and then I'll stop. I feel really bad for Hillary Clinton, because I think she would have been one of the greatest presidents of all time. But I think she was done a real disservice by her campaign team. I think they let her down. They didn't let her trust her gut and show her passion and compassion. And that, at the end of the day, came back to hurt her. And I know that sometimes people talk about the fact that she may think she let us down, but the truth of the matter is I think her campaign team let her down, because they just, they didn't get what we were getting. And they let a couple $1,000s stop a bus tour in Michigan. And I bet you they wish we had done that. So that's why we feel the urgency to drag the party, get involved with the party, and make sure that their leadership understands the importance of grassroots. So.
Amen. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments. Now I'm going to call Danielle Solomon up. And I'll just say congratulations ahead of time to Fatima. I'll have you, we're going to switch out the panels.
Thank you, Congressman. Hi, everybody. Bear with us for 1 second. We're just going to add some chairs. While that's going on, I'll just introduce the panel really quickly, and then everybody can come on up. So today, our panel will include Dr. Brian Smedley. He's the co-founder and executive director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity, a project that merges research, policy analysis, communications, and activism to promote health equity. Fatima Goss-Graves is the recently named CEO, president-elect of the National Women's Law Center, where she has spent over a decade working to increase opportunities for women and girls. Congratulations again, Fatima. Nikichi Taifa is the advocacy director for the criminal justice program at Open Society Foundations, where she works to advance criminal justice reform, such as sentencing reform and law enforcement accountability. And Tanya Clayhouse. Tanya currently serves as a senior consultant with the Schott Foundation and is the former deputy assistant secretary for pre-K through 12 education in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development, where she advised the Assistant Secretary and other senior department officials on a number of policy initiatives. Can you guys come on up on the stage, and we'll start the discussion. Yep. So, the congressman left us with a lot to talk about. So we're going to dig in deep on some of the 4 key issue areas that he raised. One of the things I want to kind of follow up on is how he really talked about making the connections, how all these different policy issues impact family. And for me, I think as we talk about raising families in America today, no matter what your race or ethnic background is, it's a challenge, right? But we also know historically, and even today, for black families, there's added challenges. So we should talk about those. We should be direct and open and honest about that. So Fatima, I would love to start with you. Because for me, I don't think we can really talk about families without talking about women. So I would like to talk about the role of black women in those families. The congressman raised the fact that equal pay is a significant part of the problem. We know that African American women on average make 60 cents for every dollar that their white male counterpart makes. What is the impact of that? What does that impact on her? What's the impact on the family? What is the impact of that?
Yeah, and thanks so much for having this conversation. I have to say I was really excited to see where the congressman started, because in many ways, you can't really have a conversation around the state of the black family and how to have an agenda around the black family without thinking specifically and deeply about what's happening with black women. And black women are both breadwinners and caregivers, and doing so in ways that are much larger than other groups of women. So 4 out of 5 black women are breadwinners of some sort for their families. When you talk about the pay gap and its deep and long-standing gap, that's a family pay gap, really. And in many ways, when I think about the pay gap, I think about it as an overall measure of inequality. Some of it is the fact that black women, even when they're doing the same jobs, make less, right? That they make less because of implicit and sometimes not so implicit biases and stereotypes that undermine their pay, undermine their promotions, undermine their ability to get the job in the first place. But a big piece of it is the fact that black women are overrepresented in the lowest paid fields. It's true that women generally are overrepresented in the lowest paid fields. Women make up 2/3 of low-wage workers, but women of color are half of that, right? So when we think about the fact that our national minimum wage hasn't increased in over a decade, we know which families are most deeply affected by that. And what compounds that is it's not just lower wages. Those same workplaces are the workplaces that have schedules that are unpredictable and unfair. They don't have the sort of benefits that match the fact that this is a modern workplace where people are actually caregiving and earning wages. So it's hard. You're sort of pulled at both ends. And so I thought it was really important that the congressman connected what's happening in the workplace with your ability to, with your ability more broadly to help your kids with their schoolwork, your ability to access childcare, your ability to access healthcare. All of these things are deeply interconnected. The last thing that I'll say around caregiving is that, black women are caregiving at every level. You're caring for children, you're caring for other family members, not enough self-care, right? And so when you put all of that together and think about the health consequences and think about, again, the fact that too many jobs do not have things like paid family and medical leave, paid sick days, really things that should match a workplace that acknowledges that people both work and engage in care.
I think that's really important. So my follow-up is, equal pay is one piece, but there are other services that are really needed to, raise a family and work. So you raise childcare, paid leave, FMLA. What legislative or policy proposals should this administration and the Democratic Party be putting out to support families? Like, if we're really for families, what should those look like?
Well, the thing is, the policies are there, and what's been exciting is that in states and in local communities, they're already moving forward with agendas that actually would work and improve conditions for working families, especially families of color. But so for sure, you need policies that are going to look at how do you raise wages, raising minimum wage, and ensuring that those minimum wage increases have one fair wage, so that tip workers are included as well. In states that have one fair wage, we know that poverty for Black women is 8% less. So there's a direct link, right? It includes actually addressing the fact and making it harder for employers to pay women less. And some of that is going to require improving our really old equal pay laws. There is, a bill called the Family Act that would provide for paid family and medical leave. Many states have gone ahead and moved ahead with their own paid family and medical leave. The same has been true with paid sick days. There's the Healthy Families Act at the federal level. But again, a lot of states aren't waiting for Congress to get it together and actually prioritize families. They're moving forward. And a real and meaningful investment in childcare is required. One of the few bright spots of this last campaign is that for the first time you saw everyone talking about childcare and the need for childcare. But really, it's one of those things where the devil is in the details, right? And it's very easy to talk at a high level and say, I'm for families. And the congressman talked about, if you talk about how you're for families and then you produce a budget that does the opposite, that guts families. So we have to be really focused on the specific details and not as much caught up on the overall message. It's going to be very rare that you're going to hear anyone these days, I hope, say that I'm not for families or I'm not for equal pay. People are going to say, I am for those things, but then you have to watch specifically what it is that they're doing.
Right. So, Dr. Smedley, I want to bring you in on this because Fatima mentioned healthcare and the congressman mentioned healthcare. So, ACA did a lot to improve access to healthcare for African Americans. There's still work to be done on ensuring greater numbers of coverage for African Americans. But a lot of your work and your research has been around less about access and more about root causes. And I would love for you to kind of share with the audience the importance of looking at environmental factors and systemic factors that kind of lead to the health disparities that we see.
Absolutely, and thank you again for having this conversation. So everybody here is aware that African Americans relative to whites faced a host of poor health outcomes ranging from A to Z, asthma, arthritis, cancer, diabetes, you name it. These are not issues related to behavior or genetics. They're related to the fact that we largely live in separate and unequal communities, right? And government was complicit in creating these separate and unequal communities. So a lot of our research shows that the persistence of residential segregation is not only at the root of the health inequities that we see because of differential exposure to environmental health risks. Disproportionately, people of color live in food deserts. These are also communities that are more difficult to enjoy active lifestyles, et cetera. But these issues are also complicit across a range of other issue areas such as criminal justice, such as education, such as building wealth. The fact that people of color, homeowners in communities that are disproportionately people of color, see that their home values don't appreciate to the same degree as an equivalent home in a predominantly white community. This is the invisible hand of racism at work. So we consider residential segregation to be one of the primary forms of structural racism that has undercut Black wealth, Black educational attainment, Black health, et cetera. How do we address it? There have been some important developments over the past 8 years during the Obama administration that directly attempted to tackle some of these issues. So yes, the Obama administration led the charge on the Affordable Care Act. 2.8 million African Americans gained coverage as a result. But lesser known were the efforts of the Obama administration, particularly in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to help local jurisdictions to develop plans to desegregate those communities and to reduce neighborhood poverty concentration. So again, let me make the point that government was complicit in creating these conditions. In the 30s, 40s, et cetera, going forward through allowing racial covenants, restrictive covenants so that people of color could not purchase homes in desirable neighborhoods, denying African Americans the opportunity to take advantage of the GI Bill to get mortgages at affordable rates. These all led to the creation of separate and unequal spaces. It's now government's turn to undo that. And unfortunately, it looks as if this administration is going to reverse the important developments in the past 8 years, one of which is the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, critically important as a tool to help communities and jurisdictions to develop plans to assist low-income families to move into the neighborhoods that they choose to. So let me be clear, this is not about moving communities wholesale. We've seen that too often in African American communities where people were displaced, which again contributed to family instability and to many of the poor outcomes that we see across the board. But affirmatively furthering fair housing was an effort to improve housing choice, allowing folk who want to have the opportunity to locate to a community with better opportunity for their children.
And when we talked a little bit about the panel, you shared with me some of the research that you did around Baltimore.
Yes.
And the impact of housing, food deserts in Baltimore, and that impact on life expectancy. Can you just share a little bit about like the outcomes of that research and what we're looking at for Baltimore residents?
Thank you for that question, Danielle. Baltimore is not like, Baltimore is very similar to many other cities around the country. Baltimore back in about 1912 established one of the first racially restrictive laws regarding integration of neighborhoods. They prohibited it by law. Those policies and practices carried forward over a series of generations. And of course, then in the 30s and 40s, you had the Federal Housing Administration actively redlining some neighborhoods. These, of course, were neighborhoods where the federal government would not back home mortgage loans, so that prospective buyers had difficulty getting an appropriate mortgage to purchase a home in those redlined neighborhoods. Of course, those neighborhoods were disproportionately low income, people of color in those neighborhoods. We did some research back in 2012 with the group Equity Matters in Baltimore, looking at a range of health risks across different neighborhoods in that city, as well as health outcomes. One of the very stunning findings that we found is that when you look at life expectancy across different neighborhoods in Baltimore, some neighborhoods have a life expectancy as low as 58, 59 years of age. That's pretty remarkable. That's lower than a lot of developing nations. Other neighborhoods in Baltimore, you can expect to live to be about 89. That's a 30-year difference in life expectancy across different neighborhoods, and some of these communities are just a few miles apart. But we went further and found an old Federal Housing Authority map showing the neighborhoods that were redlined in Baltimore, neighborhoods like Sandtown, Winchester. Those neighborhoods today are the neighborhoods with the lowest life expectancy in Baltimore. So those policies enacted and supported by governments back in the 30s and 40s continue to reverberate today and have important consequences for the health and well-being of the folk who live in those neighborhoods. The government policy of deliberately disenfranchising and economically marginalizing those communities not only led to intergenerational poverty in those communities, but it continues to affect the health and well-being of people in those neighborhoods today.
Thank you, thank you. Before we kind of switch off of healthcare a little bit, I don't want us to not talk about reproductive health and the things that, you know, the Obama administration had done and what we're possibly fearful of seeing change. So I would love to put that on the table and talk about what policies and things we should be paying attention to around reproductive health.
Right, and as you were talking, I was just thinking about the effort to dismantle the Affordable Care Act and what that does for Black families and Black women in particular. And you know, we recently did an analysis that showed that of the women who would lose their health coverage with a repeal of the ACA, 2/3 of them were women of color. And you know, and the way in which that, you know, on top of these overall systemic conditions, there's sort of direct attack on healthcare access. And over the weekend, you saw efforts to say, well, maybe we have a compromise. Stop covering maternity care and allow gender rating. How is that a compromise, right? That would only lead to to the conditions that we had before, where women were paying more for less in the healthcare market. The last thing that I have to say is that Black women are deeply, deeply affected by the fast and furious attacks on reproductive health care access that you've seen coming over the last month. And that's the case whether it's, the never-ending bans on abortion that you're seeing coming in the states. That's the case in the bans on abortion that you've seen coming in the federal government. But that's also, Congress people introducing those measures. But it's also around contraception and, efforts to defund providers who provide any sort of reproductive health care services are being floated. This will only make it harder for Black women, and this will only make it harder for families overall. And then the last thing that I'd say is the current nominee for the Supreme Court, Judge Gorsuch, he was on the panel in the Hobby Lobby case. When many of you guys may remember, that was the case where they said that, some bosses can decide that they aren't going to allow women to have contraceptive coverage. So all of these things are intermixed in ways that make women less economically secure, less healthy, and also undermine dignity more broadly.
Right. I think, one of the things, just listening to everyone and also the congressman, what I'm hearing is, history matters, like how we got here, and progress matters, and ensuring that we don't lose the ground that we have made. That seems to be a recurring theme in what we were talking about today. I want to go back to root causes, because I think a lot of what we're also talking about is root causes, and I want to bring in Nikichi and Tanya. Nikichi, you've been working for years on reforming the criminal justice system. And we've made huge progress in trying to go away from the tough on crime, outdated rhetoric that we have now seen pop up again with this administration and a new attorney general. We're hearing rhetoric that is very reminiscent of the 80s and the 90s, with policies that we know don't work. We have new data and research, and yet they are going back to that old playbook, just like we are seeing that they're going back to some other old playbooks. How dangerous is this as we talk about the Black community, the increase in police violence, longer sentences? You have an attorney general talking about, using phrases like war on drugs, where we had gone away from trying to use those phrases. How dangerous is this for, the Black community and the Black family?
Well, absolutely, it's very, very dangerous. Congressman Richmond said something to the effect of, you can't heal unless you have a proper diagnosis. And actually, proper diagnosis is that we are speedily going backward to the flawed policies of the past. I know, Burt Wise, you remember the crime bill of 1994, the largest expansion of the death penalty in modern times, the gutting of habeas corpus, the evisceration of the exclusionary rule, the cutting of Pell Grants, 3 strikes, trying of 13-year-olds as adults, refusal to address the crack disparity issue, and longer sentences and more money to states to build more and more prisons to lock up people for longer periods of time. Those are the flawed policies that we're going back to with the refrain in terms of law and order, in terms of families, in terms of Black families, in terms of families in general. We all want order. We all want law, but we want laws that are just and fair, and laws that don't disproportionately impact, certain segments of society. It is a very dangerous scenario that's going on right now, and we need to do all that we can to be very vigilant so that we don't have generations languishing behind bars. You go into prisons and you see a father, and you see a mother, and you see the child, and you see the grandparents. You see the aunts. It's like families, okay? Generations are being locked up. Surely that is not healthy for the Black family. Surely that's not healthy, for communities. Richmond talked about the CBC being the conscience of the Congress, and in fact it is. But we really need to ensure that we don't go back to, to the past. We came so far, particularly within the last term of the Obama administration. There were so many bright spots moving beyond the rhetoric in terms of tough on crime and embracing smartness and intelligence, in terms of
facts.
criminal justice, reform. Yeah, so it's dangerous.
And I would love to draw this link to education because we have seen skyrocketing expulsions and suspensions. We know that there are disparities. I mean, overall, the criminal justice system, you can see disparities at every point in the spectrum, right? It doesn't really matter where you start. There's disparities at every point. But we're seeing this in younger and younger, groupings, right? So, I mean, even in kindergarten, we're seeing things pre-K. So I would like to talk a little bit about how we ensure, especially with this new education secretary, how we ensure that there is continued oversight and that we are giving best practices so we don't see these crazy numbers of suspensions for kids of color and girls of color. I really want to talk about girls of color too.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up. I want to at least give context to how we deal with these issues of disparities within our education system. We've been talking about the challenges and the things that are faced with a black family. And when you talk about how we're spending 3 times as more money in the states for correctional facilities than we are for increases in spending for kids in P through 12. When you're spending, funding appropriations are going down for institutions of higher learning, over 44% in the states, versus increases of upwards of 46% within the states. I mean, that tells you that our priorities have not been where they should be. And you're right, we came so far, and I was part of that administration. I was privileged to be a part of the Obama administration at the Department of Education, and we were very focused. And I think what is necessary, what we have to do, is to hold this administration accountable for the progress that was being made and bring it to bear so that everybody understands that we can't go backwards and that it's to our demise as a society to allow this country to not educate our black and brown children. If we're throwing our kids out, if you got almost 4% more children of color are being expelled in preschool. That's horrendous. I mean, I think about it. I have a child who's 3 years old in preschool. It's like, what did he do? What could he do to get expelled from preschool? What? He had a tantrum? He's a 3-year-old. He does that regularly. And it's annoying, but it's something that we all deal with as parents, as mothers. And so understand that that is not how we're going to educate our children. We learn how to teach our children. We learn how to be culturally sensitive and responsible. And so I think one of the things that has to happen is that we have to continue, as I said, to highlight what was done and some of the progress that was made. I mean, it's a long-term strategy. I mean, in order to prioritize, it means you actually have to develop relationships, working groups, and understanding within the community about what is needed. You have to develop relationships, understanding what your local school board is doing and how that's going to affect the schools that are being created, understanding what the local zoning laws are going to be so that you're not resegregating our children in our schools based upon the housing patterns that already exist. I was so glad that you mentioned the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, because that was something that we at the Department of Education, when I was there, we worked closely with housing and urban development because we understood the interconnectedness between how we deal with these issues within our classroom, how we deal with trying to provide equity in our classroom by ensuring that there is diversity, understanding that not just diversity in the classroom, but diversity within our workforce. But that's all dependent also upon where they live and the resources that go into it. If we continue to only provide resources based upon the tax base, and then you keep people of color are more than likely going to be within resident housing that is much lower income, then you're not going to be responsibly resourcing our educational system. And so there's so much. I know I've kind of went around, but I think it's really important to understand the context by which we're dealing with these issues And if we keep, if we ignore the fact that our children, particularly, black and brown children, are being disciplined at a much higher rate within our education system, we're not educating them. Throwing them out, expelling them, putting them in the juvenile justice system is then essentially bringing down this entire society, because if we're looking at as we move further and further in our generations, this is a country that is going to be predominantly people of color. So why are we not educating ourselves
And investing.
and investing in our future to move it forward?
And so how important is it for us and Congress to pay attention to the importance of maintaining data? Like we have heard from this new administration that data is not, that important. How important is it? Why is that important for the Department of Education? Tracking data, how does that play into the Civil Rights Office and Department of Ed and things like that?
I think the Office of Civil Rights was a critical office within, has been critical throughout the years. I mean, the Department of Education has been collecting civil rights data since 1968, but more recently, there's been such a focus on ensuring that we actually have the transparency that is necessary so we understand what's happening in our schools. And so the importance of data collection is so we know. We didn't know that our preschoolers were being expelled until the 2011-12 civil rights data collection. Now, we didn't know that. So we were wondering what's happening. Why is it that as we look at the subgroups within our education, subgroups of students, we're wondering why is it that you're saying that there's an 80% graduation rate in this high school, yet African American students are graduating at a rate of below 50 at 40%. What's going on here? Well, it's starting early. They're not getting educated because they're not in school. And so the civil rights data collection is extremely important. And it's not just the CRDC, it's also just data collection generally. We have the National Center for Education Statistics, the Institute for Educational Service. I mean, there are so many ways in which we need to ensure that we have that information is collected so we understand what the problem is and what's happening. And if you don't understand it, you're bound to repeat it. I mean, and that is just that is history. I wish that people need to know what is happening so they can understand the fix and how to create that long-term change. And so that's why it's critical to have that type of transparency to say, so that we can actually say that, we've told you that there's a problem. Here's the data to back it up. We've been very deliberate, and I think at the department, of trying to convey this information in a way that is understandable. I think there is opportunities within the states as we're dealing with the implementation of Every Student Succeeds Act, our new education law, that we can provide this information to parents so they know what's happening in their individual schools. They know what their children, whether or not their children are being taught by experienced teachers, first-year teachers. What is the proportion within our school? What is how is it that my resources are being allocated? What is the level of advanced placement courses? How many are in my class? Or how many are in my school? What's being provided in my school? Are only certain students being provided advanced placement courses and not others? What is the technology? I mean, all of that we find out through data collection.
I can't let Tanya talk about the civil rights data collection without just naming that today is the last day to file comments around the civil rights data collection with the Department of Education, to make clear that it's important to you for the department to continue to collect this data, especially on issues like discipline, and in a way that you can see by race and gender and disability. So that's my public service announcement.
Can I just add a quick piece on the data piece too? The data sounds like a boring issue, but we need to be extremely vigilant. The statistic that I just cited to you about the difference in life expectancy in Baltimore, 30 years difference, there are efforts underway to keep us, researchers and others, community leaders and activists, from having access to that data, because this administration doesn't want those kinds of information and data to get out. So we need to be extremely vigilant on the data piece.
Exactly right.
And that is extremely critical in the criminal justice realm as well, not only with respect to law enforcement, but just in criminal justice in general. I mean, it doesn't really make sense that grassroots organizations are keeping data with respect to police-involved shootings, and the whole, in our own Department of Justice was like, doing that type of data. But along with that as well, this administration has shown that it doesn't really respect data, facts, true and real facts, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we need to do also is what Brian Stevenson always talks about, being proximate to the issue, bringing the human face into the scenario as well, just appealing to folks' sensitivities in terms of, this is a very real person in front of you whose father is serving a life without parole sentence. What does that actually mean? It's actually a virtual death penalty because, there's no chance of ever getting out. People who are serving 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, those are long, lengthy, mandatory minimum sentences. These are very real people who are subjected to this, people who are missing birthdays and anniversaries and graduations and all of those things that happen within the normal course of, affairs.
You've done this. I mean, you have clients too. So outside of just doing the advocacy and activism, you also have real clients. So you've seen this up close and personal. Can you share a little bit about like the impact of the person inside, but also the impact on the families on the outside and the collateral consequences that follow when they come back out and that overall impact? I mean, you've seen that up close.
Yeah, one of the areas that has not gotten a whole lot of attention is the issue dealing with children of incarcerated parents, the unintended, quote unquote, victims, I guess you could say, with respect to this mass incarceration. And it really is daunting. And I have become proximate to people, to families as a result, and it's really made my advocacy even stronger. Because even when people come out, despite the type of support systems that might be there within the family, they're door after door after door, obstacle after obstacle, people are being confronted with, even though they've already paid their debt to society in all of these different areas, whether it's employment, whether it's education, whether it's in health, all these doors are being shut, whether it's in housing, all of these areas make it extremely difficult for someone to, holistically, shall we say, re-enter into society. And the impact is on all of us, on families and on communities. Policies have got to change.
I agree. So thank you. I want to make sure we have a chance for the panelists to interact with the audience, so we can go ahead and take questions. The one thing I will also add is even outside of that, even voting, right? Just having the pure right to vote after you come out to like exercise your ability to vote in a democracy is also something. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that too.
Could I put a plug in for, as we take questions, civic education within our schools is extremely important. We talk about understanding our history, but we also need to understand how our democracy works. And so as we're trying to understand how the pieces are put together, I want to encourage us to really speak about the need to continue that within the classroom. That oftentimes we speak about how it is that we feel that our younger generations are not understanding, that they didn't get out and vote. Well, I mean, they have not been taught. Unless they were taught by their families, which hopefully they were, but not all have been. And if they're not learning it in school, then you kind of wonder, we were losing generations to understand how it is that our country fits together, where the money comes from, not even understanding the basics. And so I think that is critical, and you learn that within public schools. And I encourage everybody to continue to attend public schools because it's important. You understand that history, you attend a public school. So I think it's really a critical endeavor for us to really support.
Excellent point. We want to open it up and take questions from the audience. You guys can engage directly. Right here.
My name is Dana Weeks. I'm with Arnold and Porter K. Scholler. I want to thank all the panelists for speaking. And actually, Tanya, this is a nice segue to my question. So the Obama administration, as we all know, has done phenomenal things and put in place policies. However, there's a disconnect between what citizens really understand was put in place. We saw that with the elections from the right and the left, of folks saying there's not truly progress to folks saying I don't really understand what's going on and the benefits for me. And now with the presidency of 45, I guess my question is, how do we take civic education and make it mainstream when people are selecting their news sites? You guys are doing great work and you're talking about all this great work, but how do we start educating people on truly what's going on and what they're actually protecting? I would give this example just to close out my question. For example, there was a lot of movement to not have Betsy DeVos be nominated or successfully nominated or confirmed as the Secretary of Education. And a lot of people, once that happened, they stopped. But The House then, a week later, passed or repealed the accountability rule under the Congressional Review Act, which in turn means that if that goes through the Senate, that rule cannot be reissued in a substantially similar form. But no one's really talking about this or fighting about it. So how do we start getting a lot of the information that we know here in DC to the people who really want to be activists in this, so that the civic education is really being passed down to everyone so they know what to do going forward?
It's a great question, and I'll start, but I know that there's a lot of others could comment on this. You're right. I think there was a lot of activism around now Secretary DeVos, understandably so. There's always, there should be an interest and a desire to have someone who is over the Department of Education, who's attended a public school, understands public school education, and supports it. And I think that, we were in the Obama administration, understood that we have the majority of Black and brown students that attend public school. That at its best, private schools only serve approximately 3 million children. You have 7.8 million children, African American children alone, who attend public schools. So that is where we have to prioritize and ensure that we're providing an education, a comprehensive education for all students, a quality education. And if that's where the focus needs to be. And so if we're trying to kind of move and make sure that people understand how to create that dynamic and how to make sure that we're supporting all our students, I do think there needs to be, you're right, there needs to be a continuing education process that happens. You do have to have a focus on the states right now, particularly. We know that while there is a good percentage of federal funding that goes to education, a lot of it, most of it comes primarily from the states. With the new bill, you are going to have, the states have much more flexibility. And so at the Schott Foundation, one of the things that I am working with, going to be working with the grantees and work with the foundation, is trying to ensure that our parents and communities understand the effect of Every Student Succeeds Act, the effect of these new state plans that had to be created, to understand how it is that they all work together, and also understand, I think, the process, how they need to be engaged in the process. There needs to be meaningful consultation with parents, with community members, with stakeholders, all that are invested in that process. And I think that it also goes back to, if we're, it's a larger education process, understanding how our system works, but then also understanding that where the resources come from. And so if we're getting back to your issue about civic education, understanding that the local school board is going to oftentimes determine the placement of our schools, how potentially resources are going to be allocated, working on the state level to understand how they're going to be, distributing certain funding to ensure that if you have a large percent of Title I students in one particular school, what additional resources they're going to be allocating, whether or not they're actually supplanting and not supplementing school funding. So all of this is something that I'm working with continually at the Schott Foundation, but I think we all need to educate our community about our system and how it has, from its evolution, the purpose was public education, because we all deserve a quality public education. And it was never, that private schools not at their best. They were never meant to serve all students. Our public education school system is there for everyone, and it should continue to be there for everyone.
I could just add, I think your point, that's our big challenge in this moment overall, right? It is pairing the sort of law and policy pieces that we've been talking about today with the new and really vibrant opportunities we have around activism, because people are ready to show up in ways I've never seen in my lifetime. And it would be a huge loss if we missed that. And I think what you saw the congressman saying is that they are going local, that they are coming to people, not making people come to DC, and being in community with people. And that is a big piece of it. One of the things that we're doing at the National Women's Law Center is creating tools to make it possible to make this stuff accessible so that people can use them in community. But the other thing, I think what you have seen, and the Betsy DeVos piece is really important, is because people are tuned in right now to what's happening at the Department of Education. On the civil rights data collection, we were able to get on one day 10,000 people to write letters about data. And like data is important, but not everyone is focused on data. And that sort of told me something. What we saw last week when this administration started confusing schools about the state of Title IX and its protections for transgender students by rescinding really critical guidance, right? So set out a message of confusion. What you saw was people in community going to their school districts and saying, actually, Title IX requires that you prevent discrimination, and our expectation is that you're going to say something. And you saw school districts naming that and saying, all kids are welcome here. We don't discriminate here. So I'm actually, the thing that I am most hopeful about in this post-election moment is that there's new energy and that I think we will be able to tap into that, and I think it will be sustainable for over the long period of time, whether it's 2 years or beyond. People are tuned in and ready.
If I could just add, I think part of the issue too is that we're swimming against a tide of a very false and frankly racist narrative, right? So when we have 45 talking about the dysfunction in the black community, that's a pretext to restricting voting rights. It's a pretext to broken windows policing, which we know has been destructive. So calling out that false narrative, which is too easy for the average uninformed person to feed into, is part of our task going forward so that we ensure that folk are properly educated on these issues.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're out of time. I would just like to say CAP is doing the exact same thing. We are trying to go out and not just talk inside Washington and inside the Beltway, but actually go out to state and local communities. We are building new networks and trying to reach out and listen to folks out on the ground. So we are doing the exact same thing as the congressman mentioned, as well as Fatima and others. Thank you guys so much for coming. I want to thank my excellent panelists who kind of, brought real data and facts to the important issues that we're facing today. Thank you, everybody.